Okay, here we go. So, Q&A part 5, this one comes from Mango. He says, well wishes, Professor. In your lecture on the Frankfurt School, you talked about how Marcuse's critique of pure tolerance is the essence of political correctness. If the marketplace of ideas is corrupted in this way, can there be such a thing as a classical liberal response? It seems to me that the classical liberal toolkit isn't equipped to deal with this issue.
Well, it depends on whether you view classical liberalism as a set of doctrines or as a set of principles. I think that if you view it as principles, it's a little more flexible, and so it's easier to deal with new ideas as they come up. I'd be inclined to say that Marcuse is only apparently something new. What in fact he is something really old. In joining together Marx and Freud, and in choosing the satisfaction of desire, the Freudian idea of happiness as his goal, he's determined the outcomes of his investigations long before he investigates. So the assumptions that he makes are where Marcuse has his greatest problems. The assumption, for example, that he's something like a Platonic guardian because he and other German mandarins, German professors who think that they have Gnostic knowledge of everything, it's actually rather provincial. And Marcuse, when he says, look, power should be given to those who understand the real human condition, in other words, critical theorists like Marcuse, the question is, how are the rest of us benighted by the fact that we prefer Elvis Presley to Mahler, and we don't like interrogating the grounds of being? We'd rather go to Disneyland. I admit that's shallow and silly, but my point is claiming some high point to judge all the activities of human beings is the last word in Platonic hubris. Now, if you actually have those qualities, and the rest of your pals do, Adorno and Horkheimer and all that, how are the rest of us supposed to know? Because we don't have that insight. Point is, we can't. So we have to have this imposed upon us by force, because you can't get our consent, because we're too stupid for that. Okay. Can you see how this sort of double dealing justifies any and all totalitarian excess? How do they know that they're always right? I mean, who tells them? Like the logos, the Geist? I mean, where does this information come from? And apparently it comes from other critical theorists who scratch their back and validate one another. So what it is a sealed ideology, sealed from outsiders, that satisfies the will to power of German mandarins who have gotten mad at the American working class because they had hoped that the American working class would be a revolutionary class which would create the global proletarian revolution. Instead, the American working class decided they wanted to move to Levittown and flipped them off. Because the Frankfurt School, people like Marcuse, were jilted by the American working class, they turned their back on it, and they did their best to denigrate it and to make it the cause of all of America's problems. So white, blue-collar males, the Trump voter, are the basket of deplorables. And in fact, that's just slander. It's not the case. Marcuse, then, is a very dangerous radical, and I would call him a Gnostic. He believes he has some special insight that is incommunicable to almost everybody else. And that means it's a cult, not a philosophy.
Okay, do you want to go straight into the next one?
Sure.
Okay. This one's pretty short. It's from Andy N. He says, my question is, how did you think your way through nihilism?
Oh, yeah. You don't think your way through it. You live through it. Like Hegel says, the owl of Minerva only flies at night. it's looking back on what you did and the choices that you made that allow you to see and experience value in the world. So I don't think that value is something people create. I think it's something people discover, and I think it's out there. A good example is, if you're a father, the experience of seeing your first child. That's value in the world. Nobody is indifferent, or at least no one that I would wish to communicate with is indifferent to the welfare of their children. You look at that and you say, yeah, there's something valuable. There's something worth taking care of. Same with other choices we make. I think we recognize value. We don't invent it. I think that we have no more chance of inventing a new value than we have of inventing a new primary color. All right? All that we have is all we're getting. So it's learning to apply ancient virtues to the contemporary world that give you that sense that you're doing what's right. You can get a sense of goodness and rightness, which is not the reason why we behave well, but it is one of the pleasant outcomes of behaving well. So we try and be autonomous, but even autonomous people are entitled to feel the happiness that comes with doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think that was a good one. Next one comes from TJ Bonnet. He says, I'm curious if you have any advice for PhD students writing their dissertation or about to start writing. Any insights into this difficult process?
Okay, yes, I do. All right. Take out a piece of paper, write on it. Write the dissertation, stupid. The most dangerous thing you can do as a PhD candidate is called dissertation avoidance behavior. All right? You'll notice once you sit down, start writing, that books on the shelf might well need rearranging. Things may need to be vacuumed or dusted. Or perhaps you need to talk to someone about something that might be happening. Stop dissertation avoidance behavior. That's the most important thing. You have to be conscious of where you are and what you are. You're a year, maybe two, from nailing the PhD. That makes all the difference in the world. Stick with that and do not get sidetracked. I might be tempted to say, list your 25 favorite things and then cross off 23 of them. Right? You can do 2 and your dissertation. Right? Don't get distracted. Don't get sidetracked. That's the single most important thing when you're writing a diss.
Okay, and the next one comes from Felipe. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his last name because I don't want to butcher it. Hope this message finds you well, Professor. Recently I was thinking about evil in general. I know it's a broad subject, but I just want to know more about it. I guess that's the end of his question, but...
Oh, boy.
Just think about evil.
You know, you're not the only one who would like to know more about evil. It is controversial what constitutes evil. One way of looking at evil is naturalistically and treating evil as the same thing as pain. And that would leave you with pleasure as the good. It's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is a kind of... how can I explain this? A kind of self-alienation. Doing what you know you ought not to do. Let me see if I can explain that. I said this in the Heidegger lecture, but it's true and it's worth thinking about. Guilt is the unpleasant certainty that we are not what we could have been. In other words, we know perfectly well, apart from any philosophical argument about causality and universal determinism, we know perfectly well that maybe we make choices, and that sometimes we choose one way and sometimes another, and that sometimes we do a better job at choosing and sometimes we do a worse job. Well, when we do the worst job, the feeling that we have, called guilt, is knowing that you could have been something better than you are, and you chose not to be. That's what guilt is. Okay? So,
How does guilt connect to evil?
Oh, okay. Evil is a real thing. It is, it's an alienation from a self that's larger than the domain of your skin. It's the idea behind the Good Samaritan. We have obligations to other people, and we become blessed when we recognize them. We have obligations to ourselves too, and that too must be pursued. But the idea that we have obligations to other people is what connects the good in one culture to the good in another.
All right. Do you want to move on to the next?
I would say, yeah, unless that sounded too...
No, that was pretty good.
All right.
Okay. The name of this person is in Chinese, so obviously I can't say it because I can't read it. It says, in the West there seems to be a concept of losing one's soul/self to addiction. Rehab programs often stress a belief in a higher power, with Christianity being particularly well suited to this job with its themes of sin, redemption, rebirth, temptation. Nietzsche says Christianity is suited for slaves. Is it not also suited for the addict in us? What, in Dr. Sugrue's opinion, do great thinkers have to say about addiction?
Well, that's a very tough question. People of my age and my generation in America have seen the results of addiction to narcotics. I've buried friends that went the wrong way with regard to drugs. And, I lost a brother to alcohol. So I'm fully aware of the dangers of addiction. There's a great line from the Massachusetts Puritans who settled in New England early in the history of the United States, before the United States was actually founded. And they used to say that wine comes from God, but the drunkard comes from the devil. So it's not these substances, but rather the use of these substances, as a way of putting off psychic pain rather than physical pain. In other words, things like synthetic opioids are properly used for people with great physical pain. But the problem is, this easily slips over into addressing people's psychological pain. And if people are numbing themselves, which I think is the great unifier among those that abuse substances, if they want to numb themselves, they're not being honest with themselves. What is it Laertes says in Hamlet, to thine own self be true? Well, you have to admit you're in some kind of pain, and then you have to reorganize your feelings, which means reorganizing yourself. And paradoxically, what that's going to involve when they talk about a higher power, what we're going to be referring to there is obligations you have beyond your obligations to yourself. All right? It's by recognizing those obligations that you actually become free. Free in the sense of autonomous. You have an obligation to yourself to kick this destructive habit. And your real freedom lies in legislating for yourself and then enforcing that legislation strictly, conscientiously, so you don't slide back and end up addicted again. The idea of freedom as liberty easily lends itself to sliding back and further problems in addiction. And the reason why is that if you think that you're free whenever you do what your libido pushes you towards, well, actually, you're only free in the sense that you can ignore other obligations. In fact, you're enslaved to your libido. And if you have a libido that's diseased because it has this need for heroin or fentanyl or alcohol or whatever, you have a monkey on your back, and the only guy that can take it off is you. So I like Nietzsche here. Stand up and take responsibility. Also Marcus Aurelius. He said, look, I understand the problems you face are really hard. Here's the secret. Everybody's problems are hard. So there's no special excuse for yours if they just happen to belong to you. And you got to ask yourself, what is it going to take for me to free myself? How's that?
That was a great one. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think you did a good job.
I mean, it's kind of personal. I didn't know.
No, don't worry. No.
Okay.
Yeah. Next one. This is from Neo0618. What are your likes, dislikes, and opinions on the French philosophical and cultural tradition?
I have great respect for the French philosophical and cultural tradition. When they're good, it's like that old nursery rhyme. When they're good, they're very, very good, and when they're bad, they're horrid. Yeah. I think particularly in the Beaux-Arts, in Belles Lettres, in the fine arts, it's hard to find a culture that compete. I guess in some ways the Italians, but French painting, French literature, French ballet, French music are all stellar contributions, along with the French intellectual and scientific tradition. So French mathematicians have made considerable contributions, as have French philosophers. So I would say that in the French tradition, it's not like, say, English literature or German literature, where there's one central figure, a kind of sun that outclasses all the others. The French tradition is more like a constellation of great figures. I had a friend who studied French intellectual history who once said that he could reconstruct any French thinker by reference entirely to either Descartes or Pascal. And there's some truth in that. Pascal is a genuinely great religious thinker as well as a great scientist and polymath. And Descartes was one of the central figures in the creation of modern natural science. He's the one who allowed mathematical formalization, which is an enormous achievement. Think of the tradition of French sculpture, the tradition of French painting. There's such a wealth of riches in the French. I can't help but be impressed. Now, the problem is that I think that the quality went down in European culture in the 20th century. In other words, if you think of that the city is like the man, and that these cultures, these nations, these groups of individuals can be thought of as a kind of collective individual. Well, here's what I think happened in the 20th century, and it happened to different degrees to different countries, but it happened to all of them in Europe. I think that and after World War I in particular, and especially after World War II, that the great nations of Europe were shell-shocked and had the collective analog of PTSD. In other words, they had been hit and destroyed in a kind of mutual suicide pact. Germany had been bombed flat, and the Russians and the Western Allies occupied it. France was a scene of great destruction and great death. So were the Low Countries. So Western Europe is in a self-imposed free fall. And as a result of that, their philosophy became especially, how can I put it, negative and critical without replacing that which gets criticized. In other words, it became purely a negative exercise without being able to affirm successfully much of anything. So we find out from, say, Sartre or and de Beauvoir that we are alone here in the world and we must make our own decisions and we can't blame anyone else. And if we do, we're inauthentic. But they never explain why I should care about being authentic or not authentic when there are people who can authentically be awful. I don't see why any of the high-ranking Nazis were inauthentic. I don't see why I should care, much less why I should approve. So my point is, there's been a pervasive nihilism running through German and French culture in particular. And part of it is seen in the breakup of their respective religious traditions, but also there's a breakup of civil society. And this breakup of civil society and this pessimism about the future is creating a civilization that can't defend itself. And there's actually a wonderful French author named Michel Houellebecq who writes about this. I mean, he's a nasty individual, but he writes about the decline of the French intellectual class in the contemporary world. And I think that his novels are quite damning. So I have a high regard for the French intellectual tradition. I think in the 20th century, they went badly astray. And I think that the Germans took them went with them. And I think that rather than going astray, the English, who spent their time doing analytic philosophy, they didn't go astray, they just didn't go anywhere. Investigating smaller and smaller and more precise logical questions very quickly reaches a point of diminishing returns. So on the continent, the French and the Germans allowed poets to take over philosophy with predictable gooiness. Instead, we had a bunch of technicians in England and the other Anglophone countries, and the problem is that they soon became tedious, and no one knew why we were doing this. Who cares? What does it amount to? That's when Wittgenstein comes in and saves us all.
I see. So, how are you feeling right now? We have 3 more. We could cut it out if you want.
Let's do it. Well, let me hear what it is. Let's see if I want this one.
Your thoughts about Machiavelli?
Oh, okay.
That's from BR. He just says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So.
Okay. Yeah, this is a funny story. I gave that Machiavelli lecture because someone else got ill. And he'd only gotten ill 30 seconds before the lecture went live on video. So Tom Rollins, the head of the teaching company, came backstage and said, look, I need Machiavelli in 30 seconds. And we were at the Smithsonian Institution, so we were being taped there, and there was a live audience. So I just went out there with empty sheets of paper, and I free associated about Machiavelli for 45 minutes. So it's an awful lecture, but the people couldn't tell that it was awful, which makes me sort of worry. Now, I think that fundamentally, Leo Strauss is right. Machiavelli is a teacher of evil. He's a teacher of more than evil. And I don't think that he chooses evil, but rather that he accepts the fact that evil is an inevitable part of political order. There's no political order without violence. And we do well if we minimize violence, which is one of the things that Machiavelli would like to do. But it's utopian to hope that we can get rid of violence entirely. So I'll limit my discussion of Machiavelli on that. We will take this up at a later time.
All right.
If you want to see Machiavelli, you can see him as Thucydides in the Renaissance. He is a man who looks to history, in Machiavelli's case, Roman history, Livy and other Roman writers, as his example for his theory of human nature and social science.